My name is Josh Ryan. The title of my is Veto Powers Override All Outcomes Constituting the Vigor of Executive Authority. What I'm going to talk about today is veto and override thresholds and how or hinder presidential systems. This is part of a larger project with two other people, assistant professors, Rob McGrath at George Mason and John Regali at WashU. And this project takes on executives in kind of a new way, considering them from a more social scientific perspective that is using empirical work, large data, large N studies to draw conclusions about the executive, about executive power that we can generalize a wide variety of contexts. Work on executives, especially, has been based on personality. It's based on historical events, and the president's ability to bargain. It's been much more qualitative, case study oriented, and their research is in, but this is starting to move a little bit, treating more like institution rather than just focusing on the person. And research fits into that relatively new paradigm. So I'd just like to start by talking about how presidential systems are set up. The key component of a presidential system is that lawmaking power is separated between the executive and the legislature. When the country, they were worried about a legislature with too much power. Legislatures, especially majoritarian legislatures, tend to become factional, that groups they don't agree with. On the other hand, imbuing too much power in a executive is also dangerous. Executives have a tendency to become dictatorial or turn into demagogues. So the framers wanted to ensure that the legislature had its own ability to make laws and had its own ability to enforce the laws, and those two branches were separated from each other. Their power was separated, and the framers hoped by doing this, as most famously articulated in Federalist 51, that through the separation of powers, these would be able to ensure that each kind of stayed in line, that this is how they're going to keep them in their proper places. And the other thing that the framers did, and that's true in presidential systems, is each branch, the legislature, has the ability to check the other branch. That is, it has the ability to exercise a negative power that's going to stop the other branch from doing something. The most important thing the executive has in the U.S. and other presidential systems is the power to veto. The framers saw this as an important power. It was to the president as a check on the legislature, as the ability for the president to offer a shield. If the people, the executive can't protect the people from the inaction of improper laws using and federal pay by and the importance of the ability of the executive to stop the legislature from doing something. However, again, because there's this between independent executive presidential systems, the framework, the legislature of its own, and that's the override of legislative veto. When we think about the point of a legislative veto, well, the framework, if this is what they should do, they bargained about it, they thought about it, went back and forth on what the override requirement is, because before, of course, settling on two-thirds override requirement in both the House and the Senate, which is the same requirement we have today, it's never changed. In Federal 73, Hamilton talks about what kind of override requirement should be written into the Constitution. So he says, well, what about an absolute negative veto, or excuse me, an absolute negative on the legislature? That might be the natural defense, the best way for the executive to defend himself and the people against a but Hamilton says, of course, that this might be abused. It's neither safe nor alone sufficient. And in fact, Jefferson points out in the Declaration of Independence, the very thing he talks about is the king's refusal to assent to laws. In essence, the king's ability an absolute veto over any laws passed by colonial legislature. But there's nothing magical about this number. A number of other presidential systems have copied a 2/3 veto, including Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. The override is 3/5. In Uruguay, it's 1/2 plus 1, 10 plus 1, and a couple other. And it's important for the countries as well, because traditionally these are countries that tend to have had a more imperial presidents that dominate. So the veto power and the override are obviously important. We have very little how much power veto rights nature as a check executive, and how much power vetoes themselves provide the executive. And that is your theoretical expectation that comes out of override or any of those other veto overrides I talked about. The framers seem to think that a 2/3 was pretty good. It was about sufficient, the one they agreed on. But is it any better than, say, a 3/5 or even a 3/4, a higher veto override requirement? We simply don't have a clear theory to explain how veto overrides affect executive, how they limit the governor to the executive to exercise their veto. So I'm going to exercise some of these questions. A theoretical framework based on two ideas. The first is this idea of pivotal politics, developed by Crable, where he said in a separated system, in a presidential system, there are any law to move forward. These include chamber medians. If it's a majoritarian rule, it could be that person, but it includes chamber median, the executive, or the veto override pivot. Those people all must be made happy, otherwise policy won't change. And I'll talk more in detail about that. The other theoretical component that's going to go into this is this idea of bargaining between executives and legislators. The importance of the veto and the veto override are not just that they exist and the president can use a veto, but rather that the veto and veto override both exist, and the president, the executive, and the legislature can anticipate that each other branch has these tools. That is, the veto and the veto override structure bargaining, they affect policy outcomes without them ever actually having to be used. Because they have common expectation, that they are possible, it is possible to use them, and they could affect outcomes despite the fact that we observe them that frequently. So develop a theory based on these two ideas, test these ideas, using a study of American states. Now, the problem over their history, if we wanted to do a comparative analysis across other countries, we run into some problems with respect to data, but more importantly, the institutional context and the tend to be too different to actually draw theoretical, to draw clear empirical evidence of veto override effects. States, and these offer a good context because there actually is a lot of state level in terms of override requirements. There has been variation historically, and the variation right now, and states are important. They're a good environment to use this in. For another reason, they have similar culture, more or less, and they offer. So as I said earlier, states have the same veto override requirement. In fact, though most states, like the U.S. government, had to have a 2/3 requirement. They are only that 1/2 plus 1 of the legislature overriding an executive veto. Now, this suggests that this makes a 3/5 or majority override requirement makes the legislatures more powerful, and that's the basic question we're going to deal with, and we're going to try to show you how I measure that and that I come to. Now, there's some other interesting things going on here, which is this debate that understanding veto override are important not just for a theoretical reason, but because these have real effects on states right now. In fact, North Carolina was the last state to adopt a veto. They didn't adopt a veto until 1997. And when they adopted only a 3/5 veto rather than a 2/3. It is going through a constitutional convention. They're beginning a constitutional convention right now. Under that, the veto override requirement should be raised from 3/5 to 2/3. He says, and this time has some meaning, but not a lot of meaning. In Illinois, the current gubernatorial candidate, Bruce Rauner, who's running against Pat Quinn, the governor, and Bruce Rauner looks like he got a proposition onto the ballot to raise the override requirement from the current requirement, which is 3/5 to 2/3. And he says the governor is the only statewide elected official. By raising it, it helps ensure the best interests of all Illinoisans represented. Bruce Rauner might be the first gubernatorial candidate in history to try to expand his power before he elected. Unfortunately, the state Supreme Court just recently threw this off the ballot for a technical reason. But this is a stated goal of Bruce Rauner, and he's going to continue to trust the Constitution. So veto overrides are obviously relevant. They're relevant in the states today. It's important that we understand how they affect different policies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a test between this override requirement to a couple theoretical expectations, and then I'll explain how we're going to measure that. So the main theoretical expectation, as you might expect, is that larger override requirements make the governor more powerful. Now, we can't actually directly measure more powerful governors. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure legislative coalition size. This is the number of legislators who vote with the winning side when passing a bill. The theoretical expectation, I'll explain this in a second, is that larger override requirements promote larger coalition sizes. Now, it's only going to be cases. I have theoretical expectation on divided government for reasons I'm going to talk about in just a second. That is, we would veto a larger or promote a larger coalition size during periods of divided government. Yes. So I'm going to use a one-dimensional scale model. This is a pivotal politics model. I'm going to assume the veto override legislator is pivotal, and they're going to vote, as is true in pivotal politics models. They're going to vote for the policy closest to their own policy. The governor's veto. The governor has veto. The legislature can override that veto if the veto override pivot is satisfied. I'm going to make one last assumption, which is the governor's preference is exterior to the veto override pivot. In other words, the governor is going to be farther away from the chamber median than the veto override pivot. And I'm going to explain why this is the case in just a second. We're going to measure legislative coalition sizes, and these are important because the larger the legislative coalition, the more moderate the policy outcome will be. It is simply put, the more people you have voting for a policy, the more moderate it is going to be. The extreme it's going to be. On the other hand, small coalitions that pass more to show the spatially. So let's start by assuming that we are in a veto override. Is veto override. This is what that would look like on a spatial model. The executive's ideal point is far to the right, the chamber median middle, and then now notice median veto override pivot are the same person. When the veto override pivot is set, a majority can pass a bill, the governor can veto, and the same majority can simply ride that veto. There is nobody else that's needed to pass this bill. What's going to happen in that case is we're going to assume we're going to move policy to the left from the right of the chamber. Minimum winning coalition, the small legislators who could successfully pass a new policy, legislators from the chamber median to the left. Now, the reason that's the case is because the executive is losing out on policy because the policy is moving farther away from her to the left. And in fact, depending on where the state was, the chamber median may be made worse off. So they vote for the policy. Now, it's possible to have a larger winning coalition, but the minimum winning coalition includes only the chamber median and everybody else to the left. This would be the most extreme policy. Let's move the veto override to 3/5. In this case, the chamber median is no longer the veto override. We have to actually get somebody else to go along with the policy, and that is the veto override. Because policy is moving to the left, they're going to be to the right of the chamber median. Again, because the executive is losing out, so they're going to threaten to veto. They're going to try to veto. Now the minimum winning coalition has to include, that is, the leaders are made better off by this new policy. It has to include the chamber median, and it also has to include the veto override pivot. The veto override pivot at 3 status, they will not vote executive, and that is may be upheld. So the minimum winning coalition get bigger. If we assume legislators are distributed across that space, when you need more legislators, simply put, to override the veto in this case. By the way, gamma there, Sherlock interval, any policy within that space will not be subject to move. That is, it will stay the same simply because the veto override pivot will be made worse off by move to the left, chamber median will be made worse off by any move to the right. Now, of course, when we do the same thing with 2/3, the minimum winning coalition has expanded. Now, farther to the veto override pivot must include that person and everybody to the left. Also notice the gridlock interval has expanded. The executive is still exterior to the veto override pivot. We're moving policy from somewhere to the right of the veto override toward the veto override, but the minimum winning coalition veto, it must include the 2/3 person. In short, this formally demonstrates that larger veto override requirements are going to produce larger minimum winning coalitions. Why is this? It's because the legislature, if they anticipate that a veto may occur, they will have to build coalitions to override a potential veto. And we should empirically, when we go look at coalition size, as the number of people who vote to pass a bill. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm actually going to present a case study of North Carolina. I told you already that North adopted the veto only in 1997. So we should be able to compare winning coalition sizes in North Carolina in 1996 to those in 1997, if in fact there's an effect on going from no veto to a 3/5 veto. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to complete a cross-sectional analysis of override thresholds and coalition sizes using the variation across the states. And again, we should see larger coalitions in 2/3 states as compared to 3/5 states as compared to majority override states. So the independent variable here is variation in executive veto power, gubernatorial veto power, because we're looking at states. The dependent variable is going to be the size of the legislative coalition, the size of the winning coalition, the number of legislators who vote yay in favor of the bill. One other thing I need to vary the cutoff size. That is, I need to vary which bills, take subsamples out of the set of all bills. The reason we do this is because most passed by most legislatures are passed either unanimously with very high levels of support, 95% or more legislators voting in favor of the bill. Controversial, they're meaningful bills. They're what we sometimes call hurrah votes or apple pie votes. Not the bills I want to look at. I want to look at bills that are actually used. A real chance of having a veto on them. So we need to reduce. We can't measure that directly. So what we can do is we can look at coalition sizes that were more controversial. Basically, bills that were more controversial, more against the bill. Okay, so let's look at North Carolina before and after the veto. The institutional situation in North Carolina in the term previous to the veto adoption, the term after veto adoption are very similar. The governor stays the same. It's Jim Hunt. He's a Democrat. He's reelected in 1996 with almost the exact same percentage of the vote as he was in 1992. Now, one thing that could drive low coalitions is that the governor had a mandate in 1996, or he's extremely popular. Legislators were afraid to oppose him. There's no evidence for that. He's elected with a higher percentage of the vote in 1996. We actually looked at, I looked at newspaper articles from that period of time. There's no evidence that Jim Hunt had a strong mandate. In fact, it seems to suggest it's kind of a boring election. It was business as usual. Jim Hunt was not pushing particularly radical, wasn't particularly popular or unpopular. So while we can't entirely eliminate that cause, it doesn't seem like that's what's going on here. The House we have divided government. The House is controlled by Republicans. The Senate is controlled by Democrats. Republicans lose a few seats in the 97-98 term. Democrats lose a few seats in the House. Really, the only important difference in these two institutional contexts is the availability of the veto in the 1997-98 term. So something we're going to do is distributions of coalition sizes in North Carolina. We're going to cutoffs, unanimous votes, non-unanimous votes, and then votes coalition sizes less than 0.95 or less than 5% of favor of a bill. We can actually use small cutoffs. The problem is we don't have that many bills, so we can't use too small cutoffs because the smaller you use, the fewer bills you end up with. And you can see what happens in both the House and the Senate. In the House, there is a statistically significant difference at 0.05 between in coalition sizes. They are larger after the adoption of the veto. In the Senate, that's true. For coalition sizes less than 0.95. In the Senate, it's only at 0.1. The reason is we just don't have that many bills. As you can see, the distribution, we're working with a relatively small number here. But nonetheless, the coalitions become larger in North Carolina after the adoption of the veto. And importantly, no veto was ever issued in this term. Jim Hunt actually never was used until. So there's coalition sizes expanded simply because of the existence of the veto and establishment of effects. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'd like to just examine the cross-sectional effects. So the way we're going to do this is, or the way I'm going to use coalition data from this is collected by Gerald Wright between 1999 and 2000. That particular term is incredibly difficult to get data on votes in state legislatures across state legislatures. This Wright data is very good. He collected this for one term. That's how difficult it is. Do not have it online. They basis of paper with these votes on code. We went through actually. So these Wright coded all votes. As part of this passage votes that pass a bill. We had to eliminate a couple states. We eliminated states with off-year elections, like New Jersey and Virginia, because their legislative term, they have different legislators in 1999 and 2000. And a couple of information for to code final passage votes. We end up with 87, and we're simple sizes in states with majorities and with 2/3. The cutoff, by the way, of 0.75 is arbitrary. Our results are almost exactly the same when we use a 0.7 cutoff, a 0.8 cutoff. Clearly, we've got thousands and thousands of votes. We've got to use some cutoff. Other studies that use legislative cutoffs, by the way, have used lower cutoffs than ours at 0.6 or 0.7. We have to have at least 2/3 because that's the veto override threshold. So we're going to do regression here. We find only the effects during periods of divided government. Why? Because the executive's ideal must be far enough away from the champion. It must be far enough away from the potential veto override pivot. That is, they must be exterior to those other two pivotal actors. If interior, then there will not be a veto threat. Coalition will not need to be created of sufficient size to override a potential veto. During periods of divided government, however, the executive is more likely to be exterior. And by the way, this is not a partisan-based explanation. It's simply, divided government is simply a proxy for how far away the executive is likely to be from the legislative chambers within the state. The first one, we majority compare those 40 override states. In the second, under divided government there, we actually dummy out both 3/5 and 2/3. We find both statistically significant at the 0.05 level. These are percentages, so we can interpolate. So a 3/5 override requirement increases coalition sizes by about 1%. A 2/3 override percent, 2.1%. We do not, importantly, we do not see the same effects in unified government. just as we'd expect. That condition only holds when the executive is exterior to the. By the way, we use a model because votes are nested within states. The results hold regardless. They are almost exactly the same depending on the specification used. Okay. What I'd like now is I'd like to go from negative power and thinking it possibly more as a positive power. Again, in Federal 73, Hamilton, the other framers viewed the veto only as something that can stop legislative action. They refer to negative veto has the effect of preventing bills, returning bills, but we know today probably are. It seems that executives can use the veto as a threat with the legislature prior to the passing of bills. If you want to understand how veto overrides affect this, and we want to understand under what conditions this might occur. And again, this is important because it helps us explain policy outcomes. It helps us explain the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. It helps voters attribute responsibility when a policy is passed, whether the executive gets credit for it or whether the legislature gets credit for it. And basically, what I'm going to suggest is that as the veto override threshold increases, executives should become more successful in passing their preferred policies. I'm going to use the budget as an example of this. So the budgetary process is a good way to do this because there's very clear markings, there's very clear indication about who's more successful, the executive or the legislature, because we end up with a proposed budget that comes from the governor and we ended up with an enacted budget that the legislature and the governor must somehow agree on. Okay, so the way the budget process works is the governor proposes the budget, and this is true in the states as it is in the federal government. Legislature can then modify the government. They work off the governor's proposal. They pass the budget. The governor can sign or veto the budget. And of course, a veto override is possible. The other benefit of examining budgets is that we get a very clear indication of who is successful, as I said. We can avoid many of the problems we have with some other ways that people use to measure executive success. For example, with respect to Latin America, some of the literature has used batting averages. That's also true in the American context. The problem with using batting averages is, of course, executives select which bills they're going to talk about. They select which bills they're going to support based on probably their prior probability or prior beliefs about how successful those bills are going to be. They can't do that with budgets. They have to propose a budget. The legislature has to pass a budget. And the governor is going to try to propose a budget, try to get a budget enacted that most closely mirrors their preferences. Now, again, if we think about the theory, when we think about a majority override, this is a situation in which the executive should be least successful in realizing their budgetary outcomes. Why? Because they're going to propose a budget. Suppose they propose a budget at E, or somewhere in the space between the median and the executive. The legislature is simply going to change the budget to what they want. They're going to pass that budget. If the executive vetoes it, then the median and the veto override the same person. They're going to simply vote for that budget again. Their own budget. The executive, there is going to be a large difference between what the executive wants and what is actually passed. If we look at a 2/3 veto override, however, the executive, in this case, can propose a budget much closer to their own preferences. And while a veto can be overridden, the veto override pivot must be satisfied, and their preferences, by definition, are going to be very close to the executive's preferences. So even in the case where we see an override, that override must satisfy the veto override pivot, whose preferences are going to be much closer to the executive. In this case, we're going to get a final budgetary outcome that looks a lot more like the executives than it does, let's say, the chamber medians. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use time series data on proposed and enacted budgets. That is the proposal from the governor, the enacted budget. The fiscal survey of the states collects this data, they publish it. So we're going to use this as our dependent variable. what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the difference, the absolute difference between the proposed and enacted budget per capita, and look at whether higher veto override requirements reduce that difference. I also need to account for state-specific rules and contexts. Different states do their budgetary processes a little bit differently. There's a couple quirks in state budgets. I'm going to account for those. Most notably, a couple states are going to be excluded from the analysis: Alaska, Nebraska, Maryland, and Wyoming. Nebraska is excluded because it's a unicameral legislature. That changes the dynamic, and it's also nonpartisan. Alaska and Wyoming depend heavily on revenue from oil and natural gas and coal extraction. This means their budgets tend to be highly variable. Alaska, by the way, doesn't have either a state income tax or a state sales tax. So most analyses of budget politics exclude those states. Maryland's an interesting case. Maryland does not allow the governor to veto the budget. That is just a historical quirk with Maryland. So they need to be excluded. They get to propose the budget, but then the legislature passes it and the budget takes effect. One of the other things I'm going to do too is I'm going to show two different empirical models. Keewan and McCubbins, they propose an alternative model which is distributive. It's not ideological, which is what I've been using, what the pivotal politics model uses. Distributive model simply says that the governor is only going to want to veto bills when their preference is for a lower budgetary enactment than what the legislature wants. And the reason is because for zero, the governor has a preference for a higher amount. They're going to take the legislatures anyway. If they have a preference for a lower amount, they can actually veto and bring the amount closer back to them towards zero. The important thing is here, I'm simply going to look at different subsamples of all budgets, and then I'm going to look specifically at budgets that are proposals, budgetary proposals that are less than the enacted budgets. The results are the same, by the way. Okay, this is a graph of per capita budgetary proposal, or I should say gubernatorial proposals, and the legislature's actual enacted budget. You can see, generally speaking, that per capita spending has gone up over time since 1987. You can also see the dip as a result of the Great Recession in 2009 or after 2009. Here's the table of results. I dummy out 2/3 and 3/5 override requirement. Again, a negative cushion here indicates that the governor got closer to what they wanted. So as you can see, the 2/3 override requirement produces a budget that is much closer to what the governor wants than a 3/5 override, majority override requirement, which is the omitted category here. And that is true across both models. The first model includes states except those that have a supermajority budget requirement. The second model includes states as well. A number of states actually require by law a 2/3 or even higher, 3/4 in some cases, coalition to vote for the budget. Second model includes those states as well. The results are almost exactly the same. And then you'll see columns 3 and 4. These are situations in which the governor's proposal was less than the enacted budget. Again, the results are consistent. Now, interestingly, I don't find results for 3/5. There's a couple reasons for this. A number of 3/5 states also have supermajority supermajority budget requirements. So it really reduces our ability to get empirical leverage on this. Now, the results are suggestive, especially when we look at situations when the governor's proposal is less than their enacted. And the reason for that is because, well, these are states where the governor has more leverage over the budget and has stronger preferences to reduce the budget. But the results are not significant. So while these negative coefficients are suggestive, it's qualified. We can't really draw many conclusions about a 3/5 override requirement here. The results for 2/3 are quite strong, however. And again, this model was run including a number of other control variables. But you'll see the substantive effect of 2/3 override requirement is quite strong. In fact, this changes, having a 2/3 override requirement compared to a majority override requirement, changes the budget by about $20 to $33 per capita. To give you a sense of how the substantive effect of this change in real terms, Alabama, which has a majority override requirement, It is a state that is similar in population size to Louisiana. The governor is between $96 and $158 million less successful in Alabama than, say, Bobby Jindal in Louisiana, given the fact that Bobby Jindal has a 2/3 override requirement to work with. This is a very large substantive effect. In fact, it's larger than any of the other substantive effects, save legislative professionalism, which is the indicator that people generally think of as the most important thing when it comes to budgetary bargaining. So what we found is that states with higher veto override requirements have larger winning coalitions, and this is an important finding. It suggests that these states, the legislatures in these states, are building coalitions in anticipation of the veto, and they've got to build larger winning coalitions, which importantly suggests that the legislation, the policy that is produced is more moderate. This is only true, however, when the differences between the executive and the legislature are very great. In other words, during periods of divided government. And yes, we find that the veto does empower the executive during budgetary bargaining. This suggests that the executive has a little bit more power, the veto, in fact, may be used as a positive power. It's something the governor can use, a tool the governor can use to get policy enacted that more closely matches his or her preferences. I only find results when the veto override is set at 2/3. It seems likely that 3/5 has an effect, but that effect simply is not captured with the empirical models. I'd like to talk a little bit, just briefly, about the substantive implications of this. Veto override thresholds and budgetary effects can seem a little bit abstract, but these have real and important policy implications within the state. These are 3 recent examples where it's easy to see how the veto override threshold affected the ability of each of these governors to achieve policy success. On the far left, in the left panel, is Governor Jay Nixon of Missouri. He faces a unified Republican legislature. Missouri has a 2/3 override requirement. The Republicans right now in both chambers have a veto-proof 2/3 majority. Last year, they passed a number of anti-tax bills, and they passed a couple of pro-gun bills. Jay Nixon vetoed all of them. The legislature didn't think he was going to, actually. They thought he was cheap talk. He did. He surprised them. They couldn't override the veto because the bills were so extreme that even a number of Republicans balked and did not vote for the veto override. This term, they made a couple of concessions the Republican legislators did to their colleagues. They passed a bill allowing teachers to carry concealed guns in the classroom and in schools. Jay Nixon again vetoed the bill, and they were able to override the veto because they created a larger coalition, because they made the policy just a little bit more moderate to capture those Republican legislators who voted against the original override. In the middle pane is Mike Beebe, governor of Arkansas, a Democrat who faces a Republican majority in both chambers. Arkansas is a state with a majority override requirement. Arkansas passed what many have called the strictest voter ID requirements in the state. Mike Beebe vetoed it, but they simply overrode his veto with a majority. And that law has now taken effect because Mike Beebe's veto is simply not a powerful tool when dealing with the legislature. In the last pane is Beverly Perdue. She was Democratic governor of North Carolina. She had her 2012, she vetoed the 2012 budget for a number of reasons, because of funding for schools, because it cut back on funding for schools. She also vetoed a number of other bills that same legislative session, including one that would have, she vetoed a bill that would have allowed increased fracking in the state. That bill, North Carolina is a state with a 3/5 veto override requirement. That fracking bill was overridden by 1 vote. And interestingly enough, a Democrat cast that vote who, as soon as she cast it, she said, oops, I pressed the wrong button. And Beverly Perdue had her 2012 budget, the entire budget. She vetoed it because of the education issues. I mentioned the education funding. That veto was overridden again by 1 vote. If Beverly Perdue had had a 2/3 veto, and if Mike Beebe had had a 2/3 veto override requirement, their vetoes of these bills would have stood. The bills would have had to become more moderate, and the legislators would have had to taken their bargaining with the governors more seriously. The veto override produces different types of legislation. a higher veto override requirement empowers governors, empowers executives, and it also forces legislatures to produce more moderate bills. Lower veto override thresholds, as we've seen, promote extremity. They, on the other hand, veto override thresholds reduce gridlock. That is, the higher, as we saw, the size of the gridlock interval. I don't say that directly, but it should be the case. One of the inferences we can draw is that a 2/3 or 3/5 veto override requirement increases legislative gridlock relative to a majority override requirement. Less stuff is going to get done. And the negative and positive power, as override requirement increases, the governor is able to use their bargaining power, as we've shown with budgets, to produce policy that's closer to their own ideal point. And as a negative power, the governor is able to force the legislature to moderate policy, even in the absence of an actual veto. Of course, these things have implications for gubernatorial and legislative popularity, the legislative agendas, the rate of policy change, and the type of policy change. What I would suggest to you is that veto override requirements and vetoes themselves empower governors conditional on some circumstances, and that the framers were basically correct in their inferences, although they probably weren't thinking about it in terms of differences between and Congress. It turns out that the veto override requirement is an important tool. The veto is an important tool for the president, and the override requirement, 2/3, empowers the president more than, say, if they'd settled on the 3/5 override requirement or even a majority override requirement. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.